A lot of people don't believe we landed on the moon. They said, well, look at the flag. The flag is waving. There's no atmosphere on the moon. NASA was so stupid.
Charles Duke was a test pilot and an astronaut. He didn't scare easily. Yet, for decades, rumors have swirled about what Duke might have witnessed on the moon.
The evidence is overwhelming that we went to the moon, because people just refuse to acknowledge it.
Whispers of shadows, unexplained movements, secrets NASA never addressed, and that the world was never meant to hear. Brace yourself to explore one of the moon's most chilling mysteries. When Charles Duke stepped onto the lunar surface in April 1972, he was just 36 years old. That made him the youngest person ever to walk on the moon. He didn't know it then, but he was also walking into a mystery that would stay with him for the next 5 decades. He was part of NASA's Apollo 16 mission, one of the final chapters in the Apollo program, a project that had already seen men walk on the moon and return home safely. Yet this mission was different. It wasn't just about proving we could get there and back again. It was about unlocking deeper questions. How did the moon form? What secrets lay hidden in the highlands? Those ancient, rugged landscapes that had never been touched by human boots. He had trained for every possible emergency. Equipment failure, dust storms, and malfunctions. A movement that didn't belong. And for decades, he said nothing. Before his final breath, Charles Duke revealed the moment that changed everything he thought he knew about space, and what NASA might have chosen to ignore. To understand that, we have to start from the beginning, not the moment of discovery, but the foundation of the mission. Because this wasn't just another trip to the moon. Apollo 16 was a turning point. The world had grown used to lunar landings. Television ratings had dropped. Public interest was fading. Politicians were questioning budgets. And NASA was under pressure to justify every single dollar. So they made a choice, a bold one. They would land not on a flat, safe plane like in previous missions, but in the Descartes Highlands, a place no one had ever explored, filled with uneven terrain, sharp ridges, and deep craters. It was dangerous, riskier than anything before it. Scientists believe these highlands held the moon's oldest rocks, clues to the moon's origin, and maybe even Earth's. If successful, Apollo 16 would answer questions that had stumped researchers for decades. Charles Duke wasn't a man chasing fame. He wasn't in it for glory. He was there to do a job, to follow orders, and to represent his country. But somewhere in that ancient alien landscape, among the dust and silence, he saw something that didn't fit. Something that haunted him. And now, all these years later, as the final Apollo astronauts grow older, one of them has finally spoken. By the early 1970s, the Apollo program was nearing its conclusion. What had once been the pinnacle of American innovation and global fascination was beginning to fade in the public eye. The United States had already beaten the Soviet Union in the space race. Neil Armstrong's historic first step was behind them. The flag had been planted. The footprints had been made. Now, Washington was asking a different question. Was it still worth it? NASA knew the answer had to be yes, but proving it meant changing the script. Previous missions had landed on relatively smooth plains, the Lunar Maria. These regions were safer, easier to navigate, and offered less risk during descent and takeoff. But scientifically, they were limited. The Lunar Maria were younger, more recently formed from ancient lava flows. If NASA wanted to uncover the moon's deeper past, they needed to go older. That brought them to the Descartes Highlands. This terrain was unlike anything humans had visited before. Rugged, elevated, and strewn with debris from impacts stretching back billions of years, the highlands represented the moon's primordial bones. If there were secrets buried in lunar rock, this was the place to find them. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The area chosen for Apollo 16 was full of hazards. Hidden slopes, boulders the size of cars, and ridges that could mislead both the human eye and computer guidance systems. The lander had limited fuel for course correction. A misjudgment could mean disaster, tipping the craft or colliding with a rock field. At the same time, public attention had drifted elsewhere. Vietnam, Watergate, economic uncertainty. The moon no longer held the same magnetism. News outlets gave minimal airtime to later Apollo missions. Even within Congress, voices questioned the cost of space exploration at a time of domestic strife. Budgets were slashed. Missions were canceled. Apollo 20 never happened. Apollo 18 and 19 were scrapped before hardware ever left the ground. That left Apollo 16 with an even greater burden. If the mission failed or returned little of scientific value, it could cast a long shadow on NASA's future. But if it succeeded, it would justify not just Apollo 16, but the entire lunar program. Internally, NASA faced technical issues as well. Delays plagued development of equipment. Political pressure demanded results. And behind the scenes, engineers knew the margin for error was razor thin. Mission Control rehearsed countless worst-case scenarios. If Apollo 16 went wrong, there might not be another chance to correct course. All of this, the scientific stakes, the political climate, the budgetary pressures, funneled into one launch. Charles Duke, John Young, and Ken Mattingly carried that responsibility. They were trained not only to explore, but to prove that lunar science was still worth the risk. This wasn't a symbolic victory. It was a practical, measurable, high-pressure test of what the Apollo program could still deliver. Before Charles Duke became an astronaut, he was just a boy from Charlotte, North Carolina, who dreamed of flying. That dream took him through the U.S. Naval Academy and into the Air Force, where he earned his wings as a fighter pilot and later sharpened his skills at test pilot school. For Duke, flying wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Precision, discipline, and nerves of steel were part of the trade. By the mid-1960s, Duke had exactly what NASA was looking for: speed, smarts, and a calm under pressure. When the agency announced it needed more astronauts, Duke applied and was accepted into NASA's fifth group in 1966. It was one of the most competitive classes, and it came with a promise: some of them would go to the moon. But Duke's road to Apollo wasn't straightforward. He first served in support roles, most notably as the Capcom, or capsule communicator, during Apollo 11's lunar landing. His was the voice that responded to Neil Armstrong's historic words: "The Eagle has landed." Duke's excitement nearly got the best of him that day. He stuttered out "Twanquility," then corrected himself. It was a moment of pure adrenaline, but it wasn't his moment. Not yet. He came close again with Apollo 13, this time as part of the backup crew. But a twist of fate nearly derailed his career. In early 1970, during training, Duke contracted rubella, German measles. He passed it unknowingly to the prime crew, which led to Ken Mattingly being pulled from the mission days before launch. Though Duke recovered, the guilt lingered. His illness had reshuffled one of the most dramatic missions in NASA history. Duke's professionalism and work ethic kept him in the rotation. By the time Apollo 16 was announced, he was selected as the lunar module pilot, joining John Young and Ken Mattingly for the mission. For Duke, it was more than just a seat on a spacecraft. It was a chance to prove himself, not just to NASA, but to himself, to redeem the setbacks, the close calls, and the long hours spent in simulators and geology field trips. At home, the pressure was just as real. He had a wife and 2 sons who had watched him spend more time in mission briefings than at the dinner table. His decision to leave a family photo on the lunar surface was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a promise, a way to show his sons that they were part of the journey, even if they couldn't be there in person. Duke approached training with intensity. He knew Apollo 16 wasn't going to be easy. The terrain was treacherous, the goals were ambitious, and the eyes of the world, even if fewer than before, were still watching. Alongside Young and Mattingly, he rehearsed landings, drove simulated rovers, and studied rock formations until he could describe them in his sleep. Training to walk on the moon wasn't just about strapping into a rocket. It was months, sometimes years, of preparation, mentally and physically. For the Apollo 16 crew, that training was more demanding than ever. Charles Duke, John Young, and Ken Mattingly weren't just astronauts. They were scientists in training, vehicle operators, emergency responders, and, most importantly, survivors in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Every element of their mission was simulated, from the moment they launched until they splashed down on Earth. But the focus wasn't on perfect days. It was on everything that could go wrong. Engine failures, suit punctures, communication dropouts, medical emergencies. NASA drilled it all. In one scenario, Duke had to learn how to drag an unconscious crewmate, John Young, across lunar terrain, all while wearing a bulky pressurized suit. In another, they rehearsed what would happen if the lunar rover broke down miles from the lander. How long could they survive on foot, rationing oxygen? What landmarks could they use to navigate? Could they even make it back before their life support ran out? The physical training was brutal. Duke and Young ran endless field tests across desert landscapes designed to mimic the moon's surface. These lunar analog sites were littered with sharp rocks, loose soil, and ridges meant to simulate what they might encounter in the Descartes Highlands. They trained in suits weighing nearly 200 pounds on Earth. The suits were technological marvels, engineered to protect against radiation, vacuum, and temperatures that could swing hundreds of degrees. But they weren't comfortable. Moving in one was like trying to do field work while trapped inside a refrigerator with gloves on. Even simple tasks, like collecting a rock, required careful choreography. Bend too quickly and you'd fall. Fall too hard and your suit could rupture. There were no rescue teams on the moon, just your crewmate and your own training. The rover added another layer of complexity. Unlike earlier missions, Apollo 16 had the capability to travel miles away from the lander. That freedom expanded the scientific potential, but it also introduced new dangers. The lunar surface had just uncharted dust and rock. NASA engineers built replica rovers and full-scale lunar landscapes to test how the real one would handle sharp inclines, deep craters, and shifting dust. Young and Duke spent days behind the wheel, navigating fake lunar terrain under time pressure and simulated emergencies. Geology was a major focus. Apollo 16 wasn't about just going to the moon, it was about understanding it. So NASA turned these pilots into amateur geologists. They were taught how to identify rock types, spot signs of volcanic activity, and distinguish between impact craters and natural formations. Training sites included volcanic fields in Hawaii, craters in Arizona, and remote areas in Canada. On these trips, Duke learned how to observe and describe formations on the fly, just like he would have to do during moonwalks with limited time and oxygen. April 20th, 1972. After 3 days of coasting through space, the Apollo 16 lunar module, Orion, prepared to land. John Young was at the controls. Charles Duke, lunar module pilot, sat beside him. This wasn't a routine descent. The terrain beneath them, Descartes Highlands, was unlike any Apollo landing site before. From 60 miles up, it looked promising. From 300 feet, it looked treacherous. The descent wasn't smooth. A systems delay earlier had pushed back their timeline. Even as they initiated powered descent, NASA engineers weren't fully convinced everything would work. The landscape coming into view was filled with potential hazards: boulders, deep craters, uneven slopes. It was up to Young to adjust. At around 300 feet, he took manual control. Duke called out altitudes, checking fuel levels as the lander hovered above the surface. They had seconds, maybe less, to avoid disaster. Their fuel margin was razor thin. One misjudgment and Orion would crash or tip on landing. Then, like that, it was over. Back in Houston, the control room exhaled. The mission had made it. Young's voice came over the radio. "Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Descartes. Fantastic place here," Duke echoed him, barely able to contain his excitement. Outside their windows, the view was surreal. The highlands stretched endlessly in shades of gray. The light was sharp. The shadows were long. It didn't look like any earthly desert. It looked ancient. Before they exited the lander, they had a decision to make. Originally, the plan was to begin surface operations right away, but the 6-hour delay in orbit had taken its toll. Both men agreed they needed rest. So they took off their suits, strung up their hammocks, and tried to sleep. Even without the excitement and adrenaline, the lunar module wasn't built for comfort. The next morning, they suited up and prepared to open the hatch. Duke went second. As he stepped off the ladder and planted his boots into the lunar dust, he said what millions of people watching back on Earth were thinking. Fantastic. Oh, that first foot on the lunar surface is super. It was more than just words. Duke was walking on a landscape that no human had ever touched. Every rock or grain of dust was untouched for billions of years. For 3 days, Charles Duke and John Young lived and worked in a world without air, sound, or color. The moon was silent, gray, and unforgiving, but it was also a place of revelation. Their mission wasn't just to survive. It was to uncover secrets buried in dust, secrets that could explain the origins of the Earth-Moon system. The first extravehicular activity, or EVA, lasted over 7 hours. Wearing bulky suits and limited by life support systems, the astronauts moved slowly and methodically. The heat from the sun was unrelenting, and in the absence of atmosphere, shadows were pitch black. They used the lunar rover to travel further than any Apollo crew had ventured before, bouncing over ridges and weaving between craters. Their first task was to collect samples. Every rock they picked up had a potential story, a volcanic past, an impact from a meteorite, or the slow shaping of solar radiation over billions of years. The Descartes Highlands were supposed to be volcanic in origin, but the rocks told a different story. They were breccias, fragments of older rocks welded together by ancient impacts. Apollo 16 was rewriting what scientists thought they knew. They deployed experiments. One measured the moon's magnetic field. Another searched for seismic activity. Charles Duke had been trained to expect the unexpected. But what he experienced on the moon didn't fall into any checklist or simulation. It happened during a routine task when his focus was entirely on the mission. 1 second, everything made sense. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The moon has no wind, weather, or life. Its surface is still, save for the occasional shift caused by meteor impacts or microquakes. But during one of their excursions, Duke saw a flicker of motion near the edge of his vision. He turned his head, slow and deliberate, just in time to catch a shadow move behind a boulder. It wasn't his own. It wasn't John Young's either. He was on the opposite side of the rover, adjusting equipment. The shadow moved with speed and purpose. It darted across the ground, long and deliberate. His training kicked in. Take a breath, assess, don't jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a light artifact. Maybe a reflection. The moon was full of hard contrasts. Sunlight hit objects with no atmosphere to diffuse it. Shadows could appear darker, deeper, almost physical. But he knew shadows didn't move like that. For a moment, he considered calling it in. But what would he say? That he saw something move? That a shadow had acted as if it had intent? That wasn't a reportable event. That was a hallucination. Or worse, a sign of stress, something that might force a premature end to their mission. So, he said nothing. But in that quiet, weightless moment, Duke knew he had seen something real. He completed the mission, laughed in post-flight interviews, accepted awards, shook hands, and smiled for photos. But behind the scenes, he reviewed the mission footage obsessively in the years that followed. He wanted to see it again, to prove to himself it wasn't his imagination. Nothing showed up, not at first. The anomaly became a ghost in his memory, a secret he carried with discipline, but it stayed with him. Vivid, sharp, unsettling. He questioned it for decades. Did the light play tricks on him? Did exhaustion or oxygen levels distort his perception? Or was it something else entirely? When Charles Duke returned to Earth, he brought back more than rocks and data. He brought back a memory he couldn't explain, and one he didn't dare share. The world saw him as a hero. Apollo 16 was a success. The mission had delivered more than 200 pounds of lunar samples, deployed critical scientific equipment, and extended humankind's understanding of the moon's history. For Duke, though, there was something else, something unspoken, a flicker of movement on the moon that hadn't matched anything he was trained to expect, a shadow that shouldn't have moved, a presence that defied explanation. In 1972, silence wasn't just a personal choice. NASA operated under a strict culture of control, professionalism, and image. Astronauts were expected to be model representatives of science, discipline, and national pride. Talking about shadows that moved, and the timing couldn't have been worse. NASA was already facing a storm of challenges. The Apollo program was nearing its end. Budgets were shrinking. Critics were questioning the value of space exploration. Skeptics, conspiracy theorists, and political adversaries were circling like vultures. The moon landings had happened, but public enthusiasm was fading fast. Any comment from an astronaut that hinted at the mysterious, anything that couldn't be explained by physics or science, could be ammunition for those looking to cut funding or undermine NASA's credibility. He retired from NASA in 1975 and went into private business. He gave speeches. He told stories. He laughed about moon dust and floating in zero gravity. He talked about the lunar rover and the family photo he left behind, but he never mentioned what he saw. Privately, though, the moment never left him. He replayed the memory over and over, wondering if it had been a mistake to say nothing, wondering if anyone else had seen something similar and stayed quiet too. He reviewed transcripts. He watched declassified mission footage when it became available, but nothing confirmed what he had experienced. Time passed. Apollo 17 came and went. Then the moon missions ended entirely. New generations forgot what it meant to walk on another world. The few who had done it became aging legends, photographed, honored, remembered. As the years rolled on, he found comfort in faith. He became a Christian speaker and launched a ministry with his wife, Dorothy. He often spoke about how walking on the moon had humbled him, how it had given him a new sense of meaning. But even in those spiritual talks, the shadow remained absent. It was locked away, tucked into a corner of his life where only he could see it. Duke had lived with the memory for 50 years. But time changes people. And time, as it turned out, also changed the tools used to study history. Technology could now see what had once been missed. By the time Charles Duke turned 80, something had shifted. The silence he had maintained for so long was starting to weigh heavier than ever. His body was aging, but his mind remained sharp and restless. He had been one of the few who had walked on the moon. But he was also the only one who had seen what he couldn't explain. And no one knew. He couldn't shake the question. What if it hadn't just been him? What if the thing he saw had been captured by the cameras, by accident in the background, buried in hours of unlabeled film? So he went looking. It began with a request to NASA. He wanted access to the Apollo 16 archives, specifically the raw footage from the lunar surface. The rover had cameras, the helmets had cameras. There were mounted wide-angle views, and there were data capture tapes most people had forgotten existed. Some of the film had been digitized. Other reels were still stored in climate-controlled rooms, labeled by hand. NASA complied. Charles Duke wasn't just a former astronaut. He was Apollo royalty. They let him review what he wanted. The process wasn't quick. There were hundreds of hours of footage, much of it grainy, uneven, or full of static. Some of the angles were fixed and unremarkable, just rocks, dust, and the slow arc of light across a crater wall. Others showed mission procedures, unloading equipment, collecting samples, maneuvering the rover. And then, one afternoon, he saw it. A short sequence taken from the rover's forward camera as it sat idle near a rock formation. At first glance, it was nothing, just empty gray terrain. But then a shape moved across the frame. There it was. It was a shadow, but it moved against the direction of the sun. It wasn't cast by Duke or Young. It moved across the dust, then disappeared behind a slope. He measured it using scale references. The rover, 10 feet long, provided a baseline. The shape appeared to be at least that length, maybe larger. It moved deliberately, almost like it was under control. And then it vanished. Just a flicker of movement and silence. It sparked a storm of fascination and disbelief, leaving the world suspended between awe and uncertainty. In the years since Apollo, the moon had grown quiet. Then, decades later, a story resurfaced, not from official channels, but from whispers online. A grainy clip, a fleeting shadow, a voice, aged but clear, said to belong to Charles Duke. It wasn't one of us. It wasn't from Earth. Did he really say it? NASA never confirmed. The footage remains debated. An anomaly, a glitch, or something else entirely. But something shifted. Descartes became a point of renewed interest. Archived data was reanalyzed. Engineers proposed new missions. Students asked new questions. Not because of proof, but because of possibility. Maybe it was just dust and angles. Or maybe someone saw something we weren't meant to understand. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment. I want to hear your thoughts. Catch you in the next one. Stay sharp.